The plains of the Eurasian steppe stretched endlessly, a gray and desolate expanse, where the wind carried the scent of dust, blood, and fear. From this harsh, unforgiving land emerged a people feared across the known world, the Huns. And among them rose a figure whose name alone would bend empires to trembling submission. Attila. Born in 406 CE, he was a man forged in the crucible of war, shaped by constant struggle, hardened by the unforgiving environment of the steppe, and tempered with a mind as sharp as any sword. Before we delve into these overlooked tales of endurance and pain, if you find yourself drawn to the hidden corners of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I am always amazed that we can explore these ancient narratives together, no matter where we are in the world, united by our curiosity about the past. From his earliest days, Attila demonstrated a precocious understanding of violence and power. The Huns were warriors by necessity, not choice. Survival demanded brutality, swiftness, and cunning. By his youth, Attila had observed the delicate balance of fear and loyalty, noting how a mere rumor of punishment could bend the strongest men to obedience. It was not enough to fight and conquer. One had to dominate the very minds of those you intended to rule. He understood that the human psyche could be a battlefield as lethal as any plain or fortress. When the death of his uncle, Rugila, left the Hunnic Confederation in turmoil, Attila seized the opportunity. He did not rely solely on bloodlines. He relied on calculated fear and unmatched strategy. Those who opposed him were crushed not merely physically, but psychologically. The tribes he led were conditioned to terror, trained to strike with precision, speed, and unrelenting cruelty. By the time he was in his 20s, Attila had transformed the Huns from a formidable tribal confederation into a finely tuned instrument of destruction, a force that would cast its shadow across Europe for decades. Attila's early campaigns were a prelude to the horrors he would unleash. The Danube frontier was a corridor of tension, where Roman officials and local settlements feared the scourge of God, a moniker whispered with dread. Villages that resisted or hesitated were met with a terror that was methodical in its cruelty. He understood that survival depended not only on victory but on reputation. Cities learned quickly. To see him once was to tremble forever. To oppose him was to vanish entirely. The first major confrontation that cemented his reputation occurred in the Balkan provinces. Byzantine settlements along the frontier underestimated him, hoping that gifts of tribute or negotiated promises would spare their people. But Attila's understanding of human psychology was far more sophisticated than simple fear. He did not merely destroy, he manipulated expectations. Soldiers and civilians alike were rounded up, marched into makeshift pits, and buried alive. The horror of submission, the realization that surrender was not safety, but another form of torment, spread faster than any Hunnic horse. No blood spilled, yet death was absolute and the message was clear. Attila's word could be trusted, but only in the way he intended. News of these acts reverberated throughout the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Theodosius II, initially dismissive, grew increasingly frantic as reports arrived of cities being annihilated with unimaginable efficiency. It was not just the sheer scale of the violence, but the precision. Attila's forces struck swiftly, eliminating threats before resistance could consolidate. No fortress, no river, no mountain could slow him. All that remained was the calculation of survival versus annihilation. Those who plotted to resist would find themselves impaled, burned, or buried. A lesson carved into the landscape for all to witness. Yet Attila was more than a mindless destroyer. Diplomacy was as much a weapon as the sword. Envoys, gold, and negotiated truces were employed with surgical precision. The Romans, believing their silver coins or appeals to mercy might forestall disaster, were often lulled into complacency. Then came the revelation. Their city gates could open, their envoys could kneel, and still, they were no safer than those who had resisted outright. The message was absolute. Fear was the only certainty, and the scourge of God's mercy was a concept entirely defined by his terms. His strategy extended beyond simple terror. Attila sought not just to kill but to destroy potential opposition before it could rise again. Cities that resisted were razed to their foundations, entire populations slaughtered or enslaved. Artisans, scholars, and nobles were captured and driven into the Hunnic heartlands to serve as instruments of empire. The economic and cultural lifeblood of Europe's provinces was systematically stripped, leaving a scarred landscape that would take decades to recover. It was during this period that Attila's reputation solidified into legend. Not content with ordinary warfare, he pioneered tactics that were as innovative as they were horrifying. Cavalry units executed flanking maneuvers with terrifying speed, encircling towns and cutting off any chance of escape. Psychological warfare, rumors of mass impalement, massacres, and mutilations preceded every advance. Even fortified cities, knowing of the atrocities to come, surrendered at his approach, sometimes only to experience the cruel ingenuity of his punishments. The scourge of God's rise was not merely a military phenomenon. It was a cultural one. To oppose Attila was to court annihilation. To yield was to participate in a theater of terror where survival might be granted, but at the cost of witnessing horrors that would haunt every living soul. By the mid-440s, the Huns were a force that reshaped the strategic and psychological landscape of Europe. No city could be secure, no emperor confident, and no army could challenge the shadow of Attila without first confronting the terror that preceded him. And so, from the desolate plains of the steppe to the fortified cities along the Danube, Attila's legend grew, not merely in the number of lives claimed, but in the manner of their taking. Every impaled victim, every burned market, every abandoned town was a note in a symphony of fear conducted by a master strategist. Europe did not merely suffer. It learned to tremble at the name that would echo across centuries. Attila the Hun. By the mid-440s, Attila's Huns were no longer a mere threat. They were a scourge whose shadow darkened every corner of Europe. Rome itself quivered at the mere mention of his name. The empire, once secure behind walls and treaties, now faced a force whose strategy relied not only on cavalry and weaponry, but on the meticulous orchestration of fear. Attila understood that terror was as lethal as a sword. The mind could be conquered before the body even reached the battlefield. In 451, his gaze turned westward toward Gaul. The fertile lands of the Roman provinces, rich in grain, gold, and cities unaccustomed to the Hunnic presence, were ripe for conquest. Attila's forces advanced with the precision of a machine, leaving a trail of devastation that would be remembered for generations. Villages were the first to fall, simple outposts along the Rhine. The people, having heard of his ruthlessness, often surrendered, hoping for mercy. Yet surrender did not guarantee safety. It only postponed the moment when terror would manifest in unforeseen ways. The first major resistance appeared near the Catalonian plains. Roman generals, allied with Visigothic forces, marshaled their troops to halt the Huns' advance. But Attila had already anticipated their moves. His intelligence network, composed of scouts and spies, allowed him to maneuver with uncanny precision. He did not merely seek victory. He sought domination, the total collapse of morale and will. Cavalry units encircled smaller forces, struck at supply lines, and created panic in the hearts of soldiers long before battle lines clashed. When the armies finally met, the scene was apocalyptic. Dust and smoke blotted the sun, turning the day into a twilight of chaos. Cavalry charged like storms, swords and lances gleaming in the dim light. Horses trampled the fallen, crushing not just bodies but the hope of resistance. Arrows rained down, blackening the sky with lethal precision. Soldiers screamed, clashed, and died in a theater orchestrated by a mind that measured each second of fear, each moment of terror, as carefully as any maneuver on a battlefield map. Yet Attila's genius lay not merely in brute force but in his understanding of human psychology. He exploited superstition, rumor, and dread. Witnesses recounted that the Huns would display the corpses of enemies on spikes along their march, sending a silent, visual warning to every settlement that lay ahead. Towns surrendered at the sight of impaled soldiers before a single arrow was fired. Farmers abandoned their fields. Mayors fled. Garrisons disbanded. The message was clear. Resistance was not just foolish, it was a guarantee of annihilation. Attila's campaign in Gaul was punctuated by particularly horrific acts. Small towns that resisted were razed with fire and sword. Children were not spared, elders were executed, and artisans, those who might rebuild a city, were enslaved or killed. Every act of violence was intended to magnify the psychological impact, transforming battlefields into stages of terror. Chroniclers of the time spoke of rivers running red with blood, entire hamlets incinerated, and markets reduced to ash. Survivors were often rounded up and forced into the Hunnic heartlands, where they served as instruments of empire, their labor bound to the conquest that had claimed their homes. But Attila did not rely solely on destruction. He was a master of negotiation and deception. Envoys from cities begged for mercy, offering tributes and promises of loyalty. Attila would accept them, giving the appearance of diplomacy, only to exploit any slight, real or imagined. The balance between mercy and cruelty was delicate and deliberate. A single betrayal, perceived or actual, would unleash a calculated horror, demonstrating that his power was absolute and his vengeance inevitable. In one striking example, the city of Orleans, a Roman stronghold, dared to defy him. The siege that followed was not only a military engagement but a psychological spectacle. Hunnic engineers and siege machines battered the walls, while the population, trapped inside, watched as soldiers impaled the first wave of attackers on nearby palisades. The screams of the fallen and the relentless assault created a terror so complete that many defenders surrendered even before the gates were breached. Those who did were not granted leniency. Men, women, and children were rounded up, executed, or enslaved. The city itself became a lesson, a grim tableau displayed to every other settlement in Gaul. Attila's cruelty was not chaotic. It was systematic. He understood that fear was an instrument to be honed. The Huns, under his command, executed punishments that were both imaginative and efficient. Entire families might be impaled together, rows of spikes forming grotesque barricades along major roads. Markets were burned, leaving not just bodies but the very infrastructure of commerce and sustenance in ruin. By destroying the economic and social foundations of a city, Attila ensured that recovery was slow, if it occurred at all, and that the memory of his campaigns would persist long after the bodies were cold. Yet even as Europe cowered, Attila's ambitions stretched further. He demanded tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire, leveraging fear into gold and lands without the need for prolonged sieges. Emperors, desperate to preserve what remained of their power, acquiesced, sending vast sums of treasure to avert the wrath that had already devoured so many cities. To some, this was proof of his cunning. To others, it was a terrifying realization that fear could be more powerful than armies, that psychological domination could achieve what brute force alone could not. The apex of Attila's terror came in the years following the Catalonian plains. He turned eastward once more, subjugating territories along the Danube with relentless campaigns. Villages were stripped bare, fortresses dismantled, rivers and roads lined with the corpses of the defiant. Survivors were captured to serve as laborers, conscripted to rebuild bridges, roads, and settlements in the Hunnic style, an eternal reminder that life continued, but only under his terms. Throughout these campaigns, Attila demonstrated a consistency that was almost mechanical in its horror. No act of cruelty was wasted. Each served a purpose, whether to extract tribute, enforce submission, or magnify terror for those yet to be conquered. In the wake of the Huns, few cities remained intact. Libraries, temples, and granaries were destroyed. Crops were burned. Markets stripped bare. The land itself seemed to recoil from the presence of a conqueror who understood that dominion was as much about breaking the human spirit as it was about claiming territory. Attila's reign of terror in Gaul left Europe scarred, a landscape of memory and destruction that would influence military and psychological strategy for generations. His campaigns were not only measured in lives lost but in the permanence of fear he instilled. From the rivers of the Danube to the plains of northern Gaul, every village, town, and city that encountered the Huns carried with it stories of horror that would echo across centuries. By the end of these campaigns, Attila was no longer simply a king of the Huns. He had become a force of nature, a symbol of inevitability, a living testament to the power of terror as a tool of conquest. And yet, even at this height, the scourge of God had only begun to realize the full scale of his ambition. His gaze would soon turn south, toward the wealth and opulence of Italy itself, promising a new theater of terror that would eclipse even the horrors of Gaul. By the early 450s, Attila had become a name that struck terror from the Danube to the Alps. Entire provinces quaked at the approach of his cavalry, and emperors trembled behind the walls of Constantinople and Ravenna. Yet Attila's ambitions were unbounded. He had subdued Gaul, forced tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire, and established a reputation that was as much psychological as military. Now his gaze turned south, toward Italy, the heart of the Western Roman Empire, a region swollen with wealth, splendor, and a complacency that would prove fatal. The invasion of northern Italy in 452 was swift and merciless. Attila's army, a vast host of mounted warriors, descended upon the fertile Valley with the precision of a storm. Cities were the first to feel the Hunnic grip. Aquileia, an important stronghold and symbol of Roman resilience, became a nightmarish stage for the scourge of God's ingenuity in terror. The city's walls, centuries old, were breached not only by brute force but by the psychological domination that Attila had perfected. Villagers, artisans, and soldiers alike watched in horror as impalements, flayings, and mass executions transformed the city into a tableau of dread. Survivors were enslaved, fields burned, and the urban center systematically dismantled, leaving nothing but rubble and a warning etched into every stone. From Aquileia, the Huns swept through northern Italy, moving toward cities that had once believed themselves secure behind walls, rivers, or alliances. Cities that resisted faced annihilation. Those that surrendered were subjected to Attila's twisted interpretation of mercy. In one particularly horrifying account, entire towns were forced to construct mass graves, only to be buried alive, echoing the fate of his earliest victims along the Danube decades before. These acts were deliberate, calculated, and designed to imprint his omnipotence into the minds of all who remained. Rome itself, the eternal city, now loomed as both prize and challenge. Attila's approach sent shockwaves through the empire. The Senate, clergy, and remaining military leaders realized the stakes. Submission might spare the populace, but defiance would ensure a spectacle of carnage on a scale unimaginable. Attila's genius was again psychological. Before launching a full assault, he allowed envoys who bore gold, gifts, and pledges of loyalty, to enter his camp. They offered tribute in exchange for clemency, and Attila, calculating and cold, accepted the gifts. But as always, mercy was conditional and precarious, dependent entirely on the perception of obedience. Accounts suggest that Rome's ultimate salvation was not the strength of its legions but the intervention of the papacy. Pope Leo I personally met with Attila, accompanied by envoys who carried the threat of divine wrath. Whether it was fear of disease, famine, or a calculated tactical withdrawal, Attila accepted the tribute and withdrew from the city, sparing Rome from the full horror that had claimed countless other settlements. Yet his retreat did not signal mercy in principle. It was a strategic calculation, a pause in a campaign of terror, rather than a renunciation. Northern and central Italy had already experienced the consequences of defiance. Cities like Padua, Mantua, and Verona were reduced to wastelands, their citizens slaughtered, enslaved, or buried alive in a manner as systematic as it was horrifying. Attila's campaigns were not limited to mere destruction. He understood the long-term consequences of fear as a tool of empire. Survivors were integrated into the Hunnic war machine as slaves or conscripts, ensuring that the devastation was both immediate and enduring. Infrastructure was demolished, arable land scorched, economic systems disrupted. The Huns were not merely conquering, they were reshaping the European landscape through terror, ensuring that even the memory of rebellion would carry consequences far beyond the battlefield. By the end of his campaigns in Italy, Attila had effectively demonstrated the duality of his genius. He could destroy entire cities with impunity, yet his strategy relied as much on calculated restraint as it did on brutality. A city could survive if it surrendered and submitted without defiance. But even minor slights or attempts at resistance would trigger the most horrifying of punishments. And this psychological mastery ensured that the scourge of God became more than a conqueror. He became a force of inevitability, a shadow over Europe that could not be escaped. Attila's death in 453 marked the end of an era, but it did not erase the terror he had sown. His empire, though fragmented soon after his passing due to internecine struggles among his sons and generals, left a lasting legacy of fear. Tribes and cities remembered the rivers of blood, the impaled bodies, the mass burials, and the scorched earth of northern Italy and Gaul. The mere name of Attila invoked a visceral reaction, a combination of awe and horror, respect and terror, that endured for centuries. Even the Roman Empire, weakened by internal decay, understood that it had faced a force beyond ordinary comprehension, a conqueror who wielded psychological warfare with the same precision as his sword. The enduring lesson of Attila the Hun was clear. True domination does not always come through conquest alone. It comes through fear, anticipation, and the systematic orchestration of horror. Empires can be shattered, cities erased, and populations decimated, but it is the memory of terror, the knowledge that the scourge of God could appear at any moment and reduce life to ash, that ensures a conqueror's legacy far beyond his lifespan. Attila's life, campaigns, and the destruction he wrought became the measure against which all subsequent terror in Europe would be judged. Impaled soldiers along the Danube, burning cities in Gaul, enslaved survivors marched across vast distances, and the scorched fields of Italy were not merely historical events. They were living lessons in the calculus of fear. By combining strategy, psychology, and sheer brutality, Attila became immortal, not through monuments or wealth, but through the enduring nightmare he imprinted on the minds of every civilization that encountered him. And so, 6 centuries later, the echoes of Attila's terror remain. Scholars, chroniclers, and storytellers continue to recount the deliberate, calculated cruelty of the man who understood that horror, wielded with precision, could achieve what armies and empires alone could not. The scourge of God was gone, but the shadow he cast stretched long, teaching a universal lesson. The most terrifying conquerors are not those who merely fight. They are those who master the mind as ruthlessly as they master the sword.